In the vast darkness between stars, where the cold embrace of space claims more ships than any war ever fought, there exists a universal truth that transcends species, technology, and time itself. Sometimes the most broken things become the strongest foundations. When Captain Elena Vasquez first encountered the drifting hulk of an unknown alien vessel, she had no idea that her simple act of mechanical curiosity would spark a revolution that would reshape the galaxy's understanding of cooperation, sanctuary, and what it truly means to find home among the stars. This is the story of how a human mechanic's garage became the most important diplomatic station in known space, and how the simple act of fixing what's broken can heal wounds that span across entire civilizations. What follows is a tale of 5 critical moments that transformed a forgotten corner of space into the galaxy's most unlikely beacon of hope, proving that sometimes the greatest victories aren't won through conquest, but through the willingness to extend a helping hand to those lost in the dark. The emergency beacon pierced through the static of deep space like a needle through silk, its alien frequency patterns dancing across Elena Vasquez's scanner display in ways that made her weathered hands pause over the controls. In 37 years of running Vasquez Station, a ramshackle collection of repurposed cargo modules and salvaged ship hulls orbiting the dead system of Kepler 442, she had heard distress calls in over 200 different languages and signal protocols. This one was new. Elena pushed herself away from the maintenance console where she had been rewiring the station's aging life support systems, her magnetic boots clanking against the metal grating as she moved toward the communications array. The sound echoed through the empty corridors of her station, a reminder of how alone she had become in this forgotten corner of space. Most independent mechanics had moved closer to the trade routes or joined the corporate repair fleets years ago. Elena had stayed, partly out of stubbornness, partly out of sentiment, and partly because someone needed to maintain the automated navigation beacons that guided ships safely through the asteroid field that surrounded Kepler 442's dead star. The distress signal grew stronger as she adjusted the receiver, and through the viewport beside her console, she could see a faint glimmer of light that had not been there an hour ago. Something was out there and it was in trouble. Elena had learned long ago that space was not forgiving to the unprepared or the unlucky. Ships failed, crews made mistakes, and pirates occasionally ventured this far from civilization in search of easy salvage. Her station had become an unofficial safe harbor for travelers in distress, though most of the ships she encountered were human vessels whose crews spoke languages she understood and whose technology followed familiar patterns. This signal was different. The mathematical progressions embedded in the transmission suggested a completely alien method of communication, and the energy signatures her sensors detected indicated propulsion and power systems unlike anything in the standard databases. Elena felt a familiar thrill run through her, the same excitement she had experienced as a young engineer when she first encountered a piece of technology she had never seen before. She activated the station's external floodlights and began transmitting a response on multiple frequencies, including the standard emergency channels and several alien protocols she had learned during her years working on the frontier. The message was simple: sanctuary offered, no weapons detected, assistance available. She repeated it in 12 different languages and mathematical sequences, hoping that whoever was out there would understand that Vasquez Station was a place of refuge, not a threat. The response came faster than she had expected, a burst of data that made her translation software struggle and wheeze before finally producing a crude approximation of meaning: grateful for sanctuary, ship damaged, crew injured, request permission to approach. The syntax was awkward, clearly filtered through multiple translation protocols, but the intent was unmistakable. Elena granted permission and began preparing the station's docking bay, a cavernous space that had originally been designed to service mining barges, but which she had modified over the years to accommodate vessels of various sizes and configurations. She activated the magnetic grappling systems, checked the atmospheric processors, and made sure the emergency medical bay was stocked with supplies. In her experience, ships that sent distress calls usually arrived with crews that needed immediate attention. The alien vessel became visible 20 minutes later as it limped toward her station on what appeared to be auxiliary thrusters. Aylin had never seen anything like it. The ship was organic in appearance, its hull flowing in smooth curves that suggested it had been grown rather than built. Crystalline protrusions along its surface pulsed with a soft blue light, and what she initially mistook for damage turned out to be deliberate openings that revealed an internal structure as complex as a living cell. As the ship drew closer, Elena could see that it was indeed damaged. Several of the crystalline formations were dark and cracked, and the organic hull showed signs of what looked like energy burns. The vessel was roughly the size of a human corvette, large enough to house a crew of perhaps a dozen individuals, but its design suggested a completely different approach to space travel than anything human engineers had developed. The docking procedure required several attempts and a great deal of patience. The alien ship's docking mechanisms were incompatible with Elena's systems, forcing her to use the magnetic grapples and a flexible docking tube that could adapt to the ship's unusual hull configuration. Throughout the process, she maintained communication with the alien crew, offering guidance and reassurance as they worked together to achieve a successful connection. When the docking seal finally engaged and the atmospheric readings confirmed compatibility, Elena felt a moment of hesitation. She was about to make first contact with an alien species, something that, according to all the protocols, should involve trained diplomats, xenobiologists, and military personnel. Instead, it was just her, a middle-aged mechanic with grease under her fingernails and a lifetime of experience fixing things that were broken. The airlock cycled with a soft hiss, and Elena found herself face-to-face with the first alien she had ever encountered. The being was tall and slender, with pale blue skin that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. Its face was elongated and graceful, with large eyes that held an intelligence that was unmistakably sapient. It wore what appeared to be a form-fitting garment that pulsed with the same blue light as its ship, and when it spoke, Elena's translation software rendered its words with surprising clarity. "I am Healer Thys of the vessel Singing Current. We are grateful beyond measure for your sanctuary. Our ship was damaged in an encounter with those who hunt in the deep spaces, and 3 of my crew require immediate medical attention." Elena felt her training as an emergency responder kick in, pushing aside her amazement at this historic moment. "I'm Elena Vasquez, and this is Vasquez Station. I have medical facilities and can treat most common injuries. What kind of injuries are we dealing with?" Tis gestured with movements that were both alien and somehow familiar, conveying urgency and concern in ways that transcended language barriers. 2 have suffered energy burns from weapon discharge, and 1 has internal damage from impact trauma. Our ship's healing chambers were damaged in the attack and cannot provide adequate treatment. Elena nodded and led Thys through her station toward the medical bay, explaining her capabilities and limitations as they walked. The medical facility was well equipped by frontier standards, with surgical equipment, regeneration chambers, and a comprehensive pharmaceutical synthesizer that could produce treatments for most known physiologies. She had treated humans, of course, but also several other species that occasionally passed through her sector: the silicon-based Keth, the aquatic Merhai, and even once a gaseous entity that had somehow achieved physical form. The alien crew members that Thys brought aboard were in serious condition, but Elena's medical systems proved remarkably adaptable. The energy burns responded well to standard plasma trauma protocols, while the internal injuries required more creative solutions involving a combination of human surgical techniques and modifications based on Thys's extensive knowledge of their physiology. Working alongside Thys, Elena discovered that the alien was not only a skilled healer but also possessed an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that complemented her own engineering expertise. Together, they stabilized the injured crew members and began the process of treating their wounds. During the long hours of medical work, Elena learned that Thys's people called themselves the Adari, and that they were refugees from a devastating war that had consumed much of their home sector. They traveled in small family groups seeking new homes among the stars. while avoiding the attention of their enemies, a militaristic species known as the Vashdai, who viewed the Adari as valuable slaves due to their natural healing abilities. The attack on the Singing Current had been unexpected, occurring in what should have been empty space far from any known Vashdai territories. This explained that their ship's navigation systems had malfunctioned during their escape, leaving them lost and vulnerable when the hunters found them. They had been drifting for days, using minimal power to avoid detection while searching for a safe place to make repairs. Elena felt a deep sympathy for these refugees, recognizing in their story echoes of humanity's own struggles during the early days of interstellar expansion. She offered not just medical treatment but also sanctuary, while the Adari repaired their ship and planned their next destination. This accepted gratefully, and over the following days, Elena found herself learning as much from her guests as they learned from her. The Adari possessed technology that operated on principles completely foreign to human science. Their ships were indeed grown rather than built, cultivated from a symbiotic organism that could adapt its structure to the needs of its inhabitants. The crystalline formations served multiple functions, acting as sensors, communication arrays, and energy storage systems all in one. Most remarkably, the ships were capable of limited self-repair, regenerating damaged sections over time like a healing wound. In exchange for Elena's hospitality and medical care, Tis shared knowledge about Adari biotechnology and healing techniques. Elena found herself fascinated by their approach to medicine, which viewed the body as an integrated system requiring balance and harmony rather than simply a machine to be repaired. The Adari medical philosophy challenged many of her assumptions about health and healing, opening new possibilities for treating both human and alien patients. As the Adari crew recovered and began making repairs to their ship, Elena realized that something significant was happening at her station. Word of the sanctuary she had provided was spreading through whatever communication networks the refugees used, and she began receiving queries from other Adari vessels seeking safe harbor. Some were damaged and in need of repair, others simply required a place to rest and resupply during their long journey to safer regions of space. Elena found herself coordinating the arrival of multiple refugee ships, each bringing its own crew of displaced individuals with unique skills and perspectives. A family of Adari engineers helped her upgrade the station's power systems using their biotechnology. A group of Adari scientists shared their knowledge of exotic matter propulsion, revolutionizing Elena's understanding of faster-than-light travel. Most importantly, they brought stories of their journeys, tales of other species they had encountered, and helped along the way. Through these stories, Elena began to understand that the galaxy was full of displaced peoples, refugees and wanderers seeking sanctuary from wars, persecution, and natural disasters. The formal diplomatic channels and trade routes served the established governments and corporations well, but they offered little help to those who existed on the margins of civilized space. The realization that her small station could serve as a crucial waypoint for these forgotten travelers filled Elena with a sense of purpose she had not felt in years. She began to see Vasquez Station not just as a mechanics shop or a convenient stopping point for damaged vessels, but as something much more significant. A neutral ground where different species could meet, trade knowledge, and find the help they needed to continue their journeys. The transformation began slowly. Elena started expanding the station's facilities, adding new docking bays designed to accommodate the diverse ship configurations she was encountering. The Adari helped her develop universal docking systems that could adapt to virtually any vessel design, while their biotechnology enabled the creation of atmospheric processors that could provide suitable environments for a wide range of alien physiologies. As word of Vasquez Station's sanctuary spread, Elena began encountering other refugee species. The Casa High were a nocturnal people fleeing the destruction of their homeworld by stellar collapse. Their ships required very specific environmental conditions, and Elena worked with them to develop specialized docking facilities that could maintain the low temperatures and reduced lighting they needed. The Yetin were a collective consciousness that traveled in massive generational ships, each vessel containing thousands of individuals linked by quantum communication networks. Their representatives were fascinated by Elena's independent operation, seeing in her station a model for the kind of autonomous cooperation their species valued. Each new species brought unique challenges and opportunities. Elena found herself constantly learning, adapting her facilities and procedures to meet the needs of increasingly diverse visitors. Her medical bay expanded to include treatment options for silicon-based life forms, energy beings, and even a group of sentient plants that communicated through chemical signals. The work was exhausting, but deeply rewarding. Elena discovered that her skills as a mechanic translated well to the broader task of fixing the problems that brought beings to her station. Whether it was a damaged ship, an injured crew member, or simply the need for a safe place to rest and plan the next leg of a journey, she found ways to help. Most importantly, Elena began to see patterns in the stories her visitors shared. The galaxy was not the peaceful, organized place that human government propaganda suggested. Large areas of space were controlled by aggressive species that viewed other forms of life as resources to be exploited. Entire civilizations had been displaced by wars, environmental disasters, and economic collapse. Traditional diplomatic channels often failed to address the needs of these displaced populations, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation and persecution. Vasquez Station was beginning to fill a crucial gap in the galaxy's informal support network. By providing a neutral sanctuary where different species could interact safely, Elena was facilitating connections and cooperation that would have been impossible through official channels. Refugee groups shared information about safe routes and friendly worlds, while other species contributed resources and expertise that benefited everyone who passed through the station. As the first period of this remarkable transformation drew to a close, Elena realized that she had stumbled onto something much larger than a simple repair operation. She was creating a new kind of space station, one that existed outside the traditional political and economic structures, but which served a vital function for the galaxy's forgotten populations. The challenge now would be to maintain the station's independence and neutrality while growing large enough to serve the increasing number of visitors seeking sanctuary. Elena knew that her small operation would eventually attract attention from the major powers, and she would need to navigate carefully to preserve the unique character of what Vasquez Station was becoming. Standing in her expanded command center, watching as ships from half a dozen different species shared docking space and resources, Elena felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond the simple pleasure of fixing things. She was building something new, something that had never existed before, a place where the galaxy's wanderers could find not just repair and resupply, but genuine sanctuary and community among the stars. The morning that changed everything began like any other aboard Vasquez Station, with Elena reviewing overnight sensor logs while sipping synthetic coffee that tasted only marginally better than recycled water. 3 months had passed since the first Adari refugees had arrived, and her station had evolved into something resembling a small town in space. 7 different species now called the station home, either temporarily while making repairs or semi-permanently as they contributed to the growing community. Elena had learned to read the subtle indicators that preceded trouble. This morning, those indicators were flashing red across every sensor array she possessed. Long-range scans detected the approach of a massive vessel, its energy signature unlike anything in her database but similar enough to Vashti's ships to make her stomach clench with worry. The ship was still 12 hours away at current approach speed, but its trajectory would bring it directly to the station. This found Elena in the command center, the Adari healer's normally calm demeanor showing signs of strain. "The sensors you provided have detected something that concerns us greatly," Thys said, gesturing toward the long-range display with movements that Elena had learned indicated deep anxiety among the Adari people. "The energy signature matches historical records of Vashti dreadnoughts, vessels used to hunt refugee populations across multiple star systems." Elena nodded grimly. She had been expecting this moment since the refugee population at her station had grown beyond the ability to hide. The Vashti were known throughout the sector as aggressive expansionists who viewed other species as either potential subjects or obstacles to be eliminated. Their military philosophy emphasized overwhelming force and the complete subjugation of any resistance, What are we looking at in terms of capabilities? Elena asked, pulling up what little information her databases contained about Vashtai military vessels. The records were sparse and mostly derived from survivor accounts, but they painted a picture of ships designed for intimidation and destruction rather than exploration or trade. A dreadnought of that class would carry between 3,000 and 5,000 warriors, along with assault craft capable of boarding and capturing space stations, Tiss explained. Their standard doctrine is to demand immediate surrender, followed by the separation of useful individuals from those they consider expendable. They value healers, engineers, and other skilled individuals as slaves, while eliminating everyone else to prevent future resistance. Elena felt a cold anger building in her chest as she considered the implications. The refugees who had found sanctuary at her station had already suffered enough displacement and trauma. Many had lost their homeworlds, their families, their entire ways of life. They had come to Vasquez Station seeking nothing more than a safe place to heal and plan their futures. The idea of allowing them to be enslaved or killed was absolutely unacceptable. How long do we have before they arrive? Elena asked, already formulating the beginnings of a plan. 11 hours and 17 minutes at current approach speed, replied Kylix, a Kasahai engineer who had been monitoring the sensor feeds from the station's newly expanded sensor array. The nocturnal being's large eyes reflected the display screens as they analyzed the incoming threat. However, Vashtai vessels are capable of much higher speeds when they choose to accelerate their approach. Elena activated the station-wide communication system, her voice carrying to every inhabited section of the rapidly growing complex. Attention all residents and visitors. We have a situation that requires immediate community discussion. Please report to Conference Base 7 within the next hour. This concerns everyone's safety and the future of our sanctuary. Conference Base 7 had originally been a cargo hold, but the community had converted it into a meeting space where representatives from different species could gather when collective decisions needed to be made. Elena had discovered that refugee populations were remarkably democratic when their survival was at stake, and the Bay had become the heart of the station's informal governance system. Within an hour, the Bay was filled with representatives from every group currently at the station. The Adari delegation included Thys and 4 other healers and engineers. The Kasai sent 3 of their most experienced ship designers, while the Yedin representatives appeared as shimmering holographic projections connected to their massive generational ship docked at the station's outer ring. Also present were newer arrivals, the Mirtal, a reptilian species fleeing religious persecution in their home systems, the Quantum Dancers, energy beings who existed primarily in subspace but could manifest physical forms when necessary, and a family group of silicon shepherds, crystalline beings who tended vast herds of space-dwelling creatures in the galaxy's outer reaches. Elena stood before the assembled group, feeling the weight of responsibility for every life that had sought sanctuary at her station. We have approximately 10 hours before a Vashtai dreadnought arrives at our position. Based on what I know about their standard operating procedures, they're not coming to trade or negotiate. They're coming to claim this station and everyone on it. The reaction was immediate and varied according to species. The Adari showed their distress through subtle changes in their bioluminescent patterns, while the Kasahai demonstrated their anxiety by clustering together in defensive formations. The Mirtal began a low harmonic chant that Elena had learned was how they processed extreme stress, and the Quantum Dancers flickered more rapidly between dimensions. "What are our options?" asked Healer Tiss, speaking for the Adari delegation. "Our ships are capable of faster-than-light travel, but they are not designed for combat. We could scatter and hope to escape, but many of our vessels are still undergoing repairs and would not survive the stress of emergency departure. Running away is not an option for everyone," stated Vortak, one of the Silicon Shepherds. The crystalline being's voice resonated through the bay like wind chimes in a storm. "Our herd animals are in the middle of their breeding cycle and cannot be moved for another 6 standard weeks. If we abandon them now, thousands of years of careful genetic cultivation will be lost." Elena had anticipated this problem. The station had become home to too many beings, with too many commitments to allow for a simple evacuation. Moreover, running away would only delay the inevitable. The Vashti were persistent hunters, and they would eventually track down any refugees who fled from the station. "There's another option," Elena said, her voice carrying the confidence she had built through decades of solving impossible mechanical problems. "We can fight." Elena could see the doubt and fear in the faces and postures of beings who had come to her station seeking peace, not war. Most of them were refugees, survivors, healers, and builders. They were not warriors, and they had no experience with the kind of military conflict that confronting a Vashti dreadnought would require. "With respect, Engineer Elena," said Thies, "we are not a military force. We have no weapons, no combat training, no ships designed for warfare. The Vashti dreadnought outguns us by several orders of magnitude." Elena smiled, feeling the familiar thrill of a complex engineering challenge. "You're thinking conventionally. The Vashti expect to encounter either defenseless refugees or traditional military vessels. They're not prepared for something completely different." She activated the holographic display system that the community had installed in the conference bay, showing a three-dimensional representation of Vasquez Station and the surrounding space. "Look at what we've built here. This isn't just a space station anymore. It's a community of beings who have pooled their knowledge, resources, and technologies in ways that have never been attempted before." Elena began highlighting different sections of the station complex. The Adari have contributed biotechnology that can adapt and evolve in real time. The HFY have provided advanced materials science that allows us to build structures that are virtually indestructible. The Yetin collective consciousness gives us communication and coordination capabilities that no conventional military force can match. She paused to let her words sink in before continuing. "The Mirtal understand harmonic frequencies that can disrupt electronic systems across vast distances. The quantum dancers can phase in and out of normal space, allowing them to bypass conventional shielding. The silicon shepherds have access to space-dwelling creatures that most species don't even know exist." Elena could see understanding beginning to dawn in the faces of her audience. "We don't fight them ship to ship. We fight them the way refugees have always fought their oppressors, by being smarter, more creative, and more adaptable than they expect." "What exactly are you proposing?" asked Kalix, the HFY engineer who had first detected the approaching threat. Elena expanded the holographic display to show the asteroid field that surrounded the dead star of Kepler 442. "We turn this entire system into a trap. The Vashti are expecting to find a defenseless space station filled with valuable slaves. Instead, they'll find themselves in the middle of the most sophisticated defensive network ever created by a coalition of refugee species." The plan that Elena outlined over the next hour was unlike anything that had ever been attempted in recorded galactic history. Rather than fighting the Vashti directly, the coalition would use the unique capabilities of each species to create a layered defense that would neutralize the dreadnought's advantages while exploiting its weaknesses. The Silicon Shepherds would use their connection with space-dwelling creatures to position massive asteroid worms throughout the approach corridors, creating living obstacles that could damage or destroy incoming ships. The quantum dancers would phase quantum mines into subspace, allowing them to appear directly inside enemy vessels without warning. The Mirtal would coordinate harmonic frequencies that could disrupt the dreadnought's electronic systems, while the HFY would deploy nearly invisible sensor networks that would provide perfect intelligence about enemy movements. The Adari contribution would be the most crucial and dangerous. They would use their biotechnology to create false readings that would make the station appear to be something completely different from what it actually was. The Vashti would arrive expecting to find refugees, but their sensors would instead detect what appeared to be an ancient alien artifact of immense power and unknown purpose. The key to making this work, Elena explained, is that we have to sell the deception completely. If the Vashti realize they're facing an organized defense, they'll call for reinforcements and eventually overwhelm us through sheer numbers. But if they believe they've discovered something unprecedented, their greed and curiosity will make them vulnerable to our unconventional tactics. The Yetin Collective had been silent throughout the planning session, their holographic representatives flickering with the complex calculations their quantum consciousness was performing. Finally, their primary speaker materialized more solidly than the others. "The statistical analysis is complete," the Yetin announced. "The proposed strategy has a 67% probability of success, which is remarkably high given the circumstances. However, implementation will require precise coordination and flawless execution. There can be no mistakes, no hesitation, and no communication errors." Elena felt a surge of hope mixed with determination. 67% odds were better than she had expected, and certainly better than the alternatives of surrender or flight. "Are we agreed then? Do we fight?" The vote was unanimous, though Elena could see the fear and uncertainty in many of the representatives. These were not warriors choosing battle, but desperate people choosing to defend their sanctuary rather than lose it to predators who would show no mercy. The next 10 hours passed in a blur of frantic activity as the coalition implemented their desperate plan. Every species contributed their unique capabilities to the defense, working together with a coordination and purpose that Elena found inspiring despite the circumstances. The Silicon Shepherds used their deep space communication networks to summon asteroid worms from throughout the system, massive creatures that fed on cosmic radiation and could survive in the vacuum of space. The Shepherds guided these creatures into position along the most likely approach routes, where they would appear to casual observation as nothing more than drifting asteroids. The quantum dancers began preparing their most sophisticated weapons, devices that existed partially in subspace and could bypass conventional shielding by materializing directly inside enemy vessels. These weapons were difficult to create and control, requiring precise calculations to ensure they appeared in the right location at the right time. The Mirantal established harmonic resonance points throughout the system, using their understanding of frequency manipulation to create zones where electronic systems would experience cascading failures. The harmonics were subtle enough to avoid detection during the initial approach, but could be amplified instantly when activated. The Kosehe deployed their most advanced sensor technology, creating an invisible network that would provide perfect intelligence about the Dreadnought's capabilities, crew complement, and tactical intentions. Their sensors were so sophisticated that they could detect individual life signs aboard the enemy vessel and monitor internal communications. The Adari worked to transform the station's appearance and energy signature, using their biotechnology to create false readings that would convince the Vashtai that they had discovered an ancient alien artifact. The deception was incredibly complex, requiring the simulation of energy patterns and technological signatures that did not exist in any database. Elena coordinated the entire effort from the station's expanded command center, monitoring progress and adjusting plans as new information became available. The work was exhausting and nerve-wracking, but she found herself amazed by the ingenuity and dedication of her coalition partners. Every species brought unique solutions to problems she would never have thought to address. As the Vashtai Dreadnought entered the outer edges of the Kepler-Pa 442 system, Elena felt a moment of profound clarity about what they had accomplished. In less than 10 hours, a diverse group of refugee species had created a defense network that represented the combined technological and creative capabilities of multiple civilizations. More importantly, they had done something that the formal diplomatic channels and military alliances had never achieved. They had proven that cooperation between species could produce results that were greater than the sum of their individual capabilities. The defense of Vasquez Station was not just a fight for survival, but a demonstration of what was possible when different forms of life worked together toward a common goal. The Vashtai Dreadnought approached cautiously, its sensors probing the system for signs of the refugees they expected to find. Elena watched their progress on her displays, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether her sanctuary survived or whether her coalition would be scattered to the winds. The first phase of the plan succeeded perfectly. The Vashtai sensors detected the station's false signature and immediately began transmitting excited communications back to their command structure. The energy readings suggested an artifact of immense power and unknown origin, exactly the kind of discovery that Vashtai military commanders would want to claim for themselves. Elena smiled grimly as she monitored the enemy communications. The Vashtai were taking the bait, approaching the station with greed and curiosity rather than the overwhelming force they would have used against a refugee population. Their dreadnought was powerful, but it was about to discover that refugees who had lost everything could be the most dangerous opponents in the galaxy. The Vashtai dreadnought Dominion's Edge cut through space like a predator approaching its prey, its massive hull bristling with weapon systems designed to intimidate and destroy. Commander Crack studied the sensor readings with growing excitement, his scaled features twisting into what passed for a smile among his species. The energy signatures emanating from the ancient artifact were unlike anything in the Vashtai databases, promising technology that could shift the balance of power throughout the galaxy. Elena watched the enemy vessels approach from her command center, surrounded by representatives from each species in the coalition. The holographic displays showed the dreadnought's steady progress through the asteroid field, its crews confident that they were approaching a helpless archaeological discovery rather than a carefully prepared trap. "Energy signatures are holding stable," reported Thys, monitoring the biotechnological deception systems that were making the station appear to be something it was not. "Their sensors are reading us as a Class 7 ancient artifact with unknown but potentially immense power capabilities. They're approaching with scientific curiosity rather than military aggression." Elena nodded, feeling the familiar tension that preceded any complex repair job. The difference was that this time, instead of fixing a broken engine or damaged life support system, she was orchestrating the defense of everything she had worked to build. The margin for error was exactly zero. "Silicon Shepherd positions?" she asked. Vortak's crystalline voice resonated through the command center. "All asteroid worms are in position along the primary approach corridor. They appear to be dormant space debris to casual observation, but they are very much alive and ready to respond to our guidance." Elena had never seen an asteroid worm before the Silicon Shepherds had summoned them to defend the station. The creatures were massive, some stretching over 2 kilometers in length, their rocky exteriors perfect camouflage against the asteroid field background. They fed on cosmic radiation and magnetic fields, making them nearly impossible to detect using conventional sensors. "Quantum mines?" Elena asked next. The quantum dancer representative flickered briefly between dimensions before responding. "Placement is complete." 17 quantum mines are positioned in subspace along the dreadnought's projected path. They can be materialized inside the enemy vessel at will, bypassing all shielding and armor. Elena felt a chill at the implications of weapons that could appear anywhere without warning. The quantum dancers had initially been reluctant to contribute such devastating capabilities to the defense, but the threat posed by the Vashtai had overcome their peaceful nature. Mirtel harmonic arrays? The reptilian being's response came as a coordinated harmonic that Elena's translation software rendered as words. "All resonance points are active but dormant. When triggered, they will create cascading electronic failures throughout a volume of space encompassing the entire approach corridor. No electronic system not specifically shielded will survive the harmonic assault." Elena had witnessed a demonstration of Mirtal harmonic technology and found it deeply unsettling. Their ability to manipulate frequencies at the quantum level could turn any electronic device into a liability, causing everything from simple communicators to massive ship computers to fail catastrophically. Calix's large eyes reflected the sensor displays as they reported on their surveillance systems. "We have complete monitoring of the dreadnought's internal systems, crew movements, and tactical preparations. They are indeed treating this as an archaeological expedition rather than a military operation. Crew complement is 2,800 warriors plus scientific specialists." The Kasai sensor network was perhaps the most crucial element of the defense. Their technology could monitor individual conversations aboard the enemy vessel, providing real-time intelligence about Vashtai intentions and reactions. Yet in coordination status, the collective consciousness responded through their holographic representative. All coalition forces are linked through our quantum communication network. Coordination will be instantaneous across all defensive elements. The probability of successful defense has increased to 74% based on current deployment status. Elena took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility for every life that depended on the success of their desperate plan. Around her, representatives of 7 different species waited for her signal to begin the most unconventional military action in recorded galactic history. The dreadnought was now only 6 hours away from the station, close enough for detailed scans, but still far enough out to avoid immediate detection of the coalition's true nature. Elena watched as the Vashtai vessel deployed scientific probes and began transmitting what appeared to be archaeological survey protocols. "They're taking the bait completely," Elena murmured, watching the enemy communications traffic flow across her displays. "Their commander thinks he's discovered the find of the century." Commander Krax was indeed convinced that he was about to claim the greatest prize of his military career. The ancient artifact's energy readings suggested technology that was millions of years beyond even the most advanced current civilizations. Control of such an artifact would elevate his status within the Vashtai hierarchy and provide his species with tools for unlimited expansion. The dreadnought's approach became more cautious as it drew closer to the station, but the caution was scientific rather than military. Krax deployed additional sensor probes and began detailed scans of the artifact's exterior, looking for access points and potential hazards rather than defensive systems. Elena watched the enemy probes move through the asteroid field, their sophisticated sensors recording everything they encountered. The Silicon Shepherd's asteroid worms remained perfectly motionless, their biological camouflage fooling even the most advanced detection systems. To the Vashtai sensors, they appeared to be nothing more than particularly large chunks of space debris. "Contact in 4 hours," Kalix reported. "Their scientific teams are preparing boarding protocols. They plan to dock with the artifact and establish a research station." The Vashtai were walking directly into the Coalition's trap, their greed and curiosity overriding their natural military caution. Once they were close enough to begin boarding procedures, they would be vulnerable to every element of the defense network. The next 3 hours passed slowly as the dreadnought continued its approach. Elena used the time to review final preparations and coordinate last-minute adjustments to the defense plan. Every species reported ready status, but she could sense the tension and fear that filled the command center. Most of these beings had never been involved in combat of any kind, let alone the kind of desperate battle they were about to fight. They were refugees, survivors, and builders who had come to Vasquez Station seeking peace and sanctuary. Now they were preparing to fight for their lives against one of the galaxy's most aggressive military powers. "Elena," Thys said quietly, approaching her command station, "whatever happens in the next few hours, I want you to know that the Adari consider you a hero of our people. You have given us something we never expected to find, a home worth defending." Similar sentiments came from representatives of the other species, each expressing gratitude for the sanctuary that Elena had provided and determination to defend what they had built together. Elena felt a deep sense of pride mixed with apprehension as she realized that Vasquez Station had become much more than a mechanical repair facility. It had become a symbol of what was possible when different species chose cooperation over conflict. "Contact in 30 minutes. Kalix announced. "The dreadnought is beginning final approach procedures. They're deploying boarding craft and establishing a perimeter." Elena activated the Coalition communication network that the Yetin had established, instantly connecting every defensive element throughout the system. "All stations, this is Vasquez Station Command. Prepare for Phase 1 implementation on my mark." The Vashtai boarding craft launched from the dreadnought in perfect formation, their sleek hulls designed for rapid deployment of military personnel. Commander Krax watched from the Dreadnought's bridge as his troops approached the ancient artifact, already planning the glory that would come from controlling such advanced technology. The boarding craft were halfway to the station when Elena gave the signal for Phase 1 to begin. "Now," she said simply. The asteroid worms moved first, their massive forms suddenly coming alive throughout the approach corridor. What had appeared to be harmless space debris transformed into living obstacles that struck the boarding craft with devastating force. Several of the smaller vessels were destroyed instantly, their crews never understanding what had hit them. Simultaneously, the Mertal harmonic arrays activated, sending cascading frequency waves throughout the engagement zone. Electronic systems aboard the surviving boarding craft began failing in sequence, leaving their crews blind and helpless as their navigation and communication systems died. The quantum dancers materialized their minds at strategic locations within the dreadnought itself, the weapons appearing without warning in critical ship systems. Explosions began rippling through the massive vessel's interior as quantum mines detonated in engine compartments, weapon storage areas, and command centers. Commander Krax watched in horror as his perfectly planned archaeological expedition transformed into a nightmare of impossible attacks. His boarding force was being destroyed by what appeared to be living asteroids, while his own ship suffered internal explosions that no conventional weapon could have caused. "Emergency combat protocols!" Krax roared, his scaled features contorting with rage and confusion. "All weapons target the artifact! Destroy it immediately!" But the Dreadnought's weapon systems were among the first casualties of the quantum mine assault. Power conduits severed, targeting computers crashed, and weapon storage compartments vented their contents into space as the ship's infrastructure collapsed under the coordinated attack. Elena watched the battle unfold with grim satisfaction, coordinating the coalition response through the Yetin communication network. The first phase had succeeded beyond her expectations, neutralizing the Dreadnought's offensive capabilities and crippling its boarding force. "Phase 2, she ordered. The Casas High sensor network shifted from passive observation to active interference, jamming the Dreadnought's communication systems and preventing any calls for reinforcement. Simultaneously, the Adari biotechnological systems began adapting their deception, making the station appear to grow larger and more threatening as the battle continued. The Silicon Shepherds directed their asteroid worms to begin a coordinated assault on the dreadnought itself, the massive creatures swarming over the vessel's hull and tearing at its armor plating with surprising effectiveness. The ship's exterior defenses were designed to repel conventional weapons, not living creatures that could adapt their attack patterns in real time. Elena felt a moment of profound amazement as she watched the battle progress. The coalition was not just winning, they were dominating a military force that should have been able to destroy them easily. The key was their unconventional approach, using capabilities that the Vashtai had never encountered and could not effectively counter. Commander Krax found himself trapped aboard a dying ship, his crew panicking as systems failed throughout the vessel. The ancient artifact had transformed into something beyond his worst nightmares, demonstrating powers that defied every principle of known warfare. "Retreat!" he finally ordered, abandoning his dreams of glory as survival became the only priority. All remaining craft, emergency jump to hyperspace. But even retreat was denied to the Vashtai forces. The Mertal harmonic arrays had damaged the Dreadnought's faster-than-light drive systems, while the quantum mines had severed critical control linkages. The massive vessel was trapped in normal space, helpless against opponents it could not understand or effectively fight. Elena opened a communication channel to the crippled Dreadnought, her voice carrying clearly through the quantum communication network. "Commander Krax, this is Elena Vasquez of Vasquez Station. Your ship is disabled and your forces are neutralized." "I'm prepared to offer terms for your surrender." The silence that followed stretched for several minutes before Krax responded, his voice filled with confusion and defeat. "What are you?" "The readings indicate an ancient artifact, but no archaeological site fights back with living weapons and impossible technologies." Elena smiled, feeling a surge of satisfaction at the confusion in the enemy commander's voice. "We're something your databases don't have information about, Commander. We're a community of refugee species who have chosen to work together rather than fight each other, and we've just demonstrated that cooperation can be more powerful than conquest." The revelation that they had been defeated by refugees rather than an ancient superweapon was perhaps the most devastating blow to Vashtai pride. Elena could hear the shock and humiliation in Krax's response. Refugees did this? Impossible. The sensor readings, the impossible weapons, the coordination, all the result of different species pooling their knowledge and capabilities, Elena explained. Your mistake was assuming that, because we're refugees, we're helpless. You've just learned that some refugees have nothing left to lose, which makes them very dangerous opponents. The terms Elena offered were generous but non-negotiable. The Vashtai crew would be allowed to repair their ship using materials and assistance provided by the station, but only after surrendering their weapons and submitting to monitoring. More importantly, they would carry a message back to their government about the new reality they had encountered. Vasquez Station was no longer just a mechanical repair facility or a refugee sanctuary. It had become something unprecedented in galactic history, a neutral space where different species could gather safely, knowing that they would be protected by the combined capabilities of multiple civilizations working in cooperation. The battle was over, but Elena knew that the real work was just beginning. Word of what had happened would spread throughout both official and unofficial communication networks, attracting attention from powers that had previously ignored the activities of refugee populations. Some of that attention would be positive, bringing new species seeking sanctuary and cooperation. But some would be negative, as established governments and military powers realized that a new force had emerged in galactic politics, one that operated outside their control and represented a potential threat to their dominance. Elena looked around the command center at the representatives of 7 different species who had just proven that cooperation could triumph over aggression. They had defended their sanctuary successfully, but in doing so, they had also announced to the galaxy that something new and unprecedented was growing in the forgotten corners of space. The Mechanics Accord had just claimed its first major victory, but Elena suspected that much greater challenges lay ahead. 6 months after the defeat of the Vashtai dreadnought, Vasquez Station had transformed into something that defied every conventional definition of space infrastructure. What had once been a simple mechanical repair facility now resembled a small city floating in the depths of space, its expanding rings and modules housing a permanent population of over 12,000 beings from 43 different species. Elena stood in the observation deck of the station's newest section, watching as construction crews worked to complete the latest expansion. Badari bioengineers worked alongside Causas High metallurgists and Silicon Shepherd mineral specialists, their combined efforts producing architectural marvels that would have been impossible for any single species to achieve. The new residential complex used living metal that could adapt its internal structure to the specific environmental needs of its inhabitants, while crystalline information networks provided instant communication throughout the growing station. The transformation had not occurred without challenges. Word of the Coalition's victory over the Vashtai had spread throughout the galaxy, bringing both opportunities and complications that Elena had never anticipated. Official diplomatic missions arrived almost weekly, seeking to establish formal relations with what galactic governments were beginning to recognize as a new political entity. Refugees continued to arrive in increasing numbers seeking the sanctuary that Vasquez Station provided. But so did traders, researchers, and other groups attracted by the unique cooperative environment the Coalition had created. Most significantly, other defensive coalitions had begun forming throughout refugee communities across the galaxy. Inspired by the example of Vasquez Station's successful resistance, these groups reached out for guidance, assistance, and coordination, gradually creating an informal network of mutual support that spanned multiple star systems. Elena had found herself thrust into a role she had never sought, leader of what galactic observers were calling the Refugee Alliance, an unprecedented coalition of displaced peoples who had chosen cooperation over individual survival. The responsibility was overwhelming, but the work itself remained fundamentally the same as it had always been. She was still fixing things that were broken, just on a much larger scale. The morning's priority was a diplomatic crisis that threatened to destabilize the entire region. The Terran Colonial Authority, humanity's primary interstellar government, had decided that Vasquez Station's success represented a potential threat to established political order. They had dispatched Admiral Sarah Chen aboard the dreadnought Righteous Endeavor with an ultimatum: submit to TCA oversight or face forcible dissolution. Elena had mixed feelings about the confrontation with her own species' government. She understood the TCA's concerns about unauthorized political developments in their claimed territories, but she also knew that the coalition represented something far more important than a potential threat to established authority. The refugees who had found sanctuary at her station had nowhere else to go, and the cooperative networks they had built were providing crucial support to displaced populations throughout the galaxy. Admiral Chen had requested a formal diplomatic meeting to discuss the station's status, and Elena had agreed to the meeting while making it clear that the coalition would not accept any arrangement that compromised their independence or their ability to provide sanctuary to those who needed it. The meeting took place in Conference Base 7, the same space where Elena had first proposed fighting the Vashtai rather than fleeing. The bay had been expanded several times since then, and its walls now displayed holographic representations of all 43 species that called the station home. The sight was both beautiful and humbling, a visual reminder of the diversity that the coalition had successfully brought together. Admiral Chen arrived with a small diplomatic team, her bearing professional but clearly tense. Elena recognized the type, a career military officer who believed in order, hierarchy, and the importance of established authority. The admiral would view the coalition as an anomaly that needed to be corrected rather than a success to be celebrated. "Engineer Vasquez," Admiral Chen began, her tone formal but not unfriendly. "I've been instructed to discuss the current status of this facility and its relationship with the Terran Colonial Authority. As you're aware, this station operates within TCA territorial claims, which makes your recent activities a matter of official concern." But she found herself feeling defensive despite her efforts to remain diplomatic. "Admiral, I appreciate your willingness to discuss these issues directly. I should clarify that this station predates TCA territorial claims in this system by more than 15 years, and our activities have always been conducted in accordance with established salvage and sanctuary laws." "That may be true for your original operations," Admiral Chen replied, "but the current situation goes far beyond individual salvage rights. Our intelligence indicates that you're harboring refugees from multiple ongoing conflicts, providing military assistance to unauthorized groups, and operating what amounts to an independent government without any legal foundation." Elena felt her temper beginning to rise, but this placed a calming hand on her arm. The Adari healer had become her closest advisor over the past months, and their subtle bioempathic abilities helped Elena maintain emotional balance during difficult negotiations. "Admiral, let me ask you a question," Elena said. "When refugees flee persecution, war, or natural disaster, where exactly are they supposed to go? The formal diplomatic channels you represent have done nothing to address the displacement of entire populations. We're filling a gap that your government and others have chosen to ignore." Admiral Chen's expression softened slightly, suggesting that Elena's words had found their mark. "I understand the humanitarian motivation, Engineer Vasquez, but good intentions don't excuse the security risks you're creating. An unregulated coalition of armed refugee groups represents a potential threat to regional stability." "Armed?" Elena almost laughed at the description. "Admiral, would you like to meet our military forces? They're healers, engineers, farmers, artists, and teachers who were forced to defend themselves when the alternative was slavery or death. They're not interested in conquest or expansion. They just want a safe place to rebuild their lives." Elena activated the conference space holographic display system, showing real-time views of life throughout the station. Children from a dozen species played together in the education centers, while their parents worked on research projects that benefited the entire community. Gardens that combined the agricultural techniques of multiple civilizations provided food for the growing population, while workshops produced tools and technologies that were shared freely among all coalition members. "This is what you consider a security threat?" Elena asked. "A community of refugees who have chosen cooperation over conflict?" Admiral Chen studied the displays with obvious interest, her military training warring with her human compassion as she observed the daily life of the coalition. Elena could see the Admiral struggling with the disconnect between official policy and the reality of what Vasquez Station had become. "I can see that this isn't what our briefing suggested," Admiral Chen admitted, "but the fact remains that you're operating outside established legal frameworks. The TCA cannot simply ignore the existence of an independent political entity within its territorial claims." Elena had anticipated this argument and had prepared a response that she hoped would satisfy both the Admiral's concerns and the coalition's need for independence. What if we weren't independent? What if we were operating under a legal framework that satisfied TCA requirements while preserving our ability to provide sanctuary? Admiral Chen raised an eyebrow. "What exactly are you proposing?" Elena activated another holographic display, this one showing legal documents that CASA's high researchers had been developing for the past several months. Sanctuary Station status under Article 15 of the Colonial Settlement Act. It's an existing legal framework that allows civilian facilities to provide emergency services in frontier regions, with full autonomy over internal operations as long as they don't interfere with established government functions. Article 15 was indeed a legitimate provision of TCA law, though it had rarely been invoked due to the specific circumstances required for its implementation. Elena watched as Admiral Chen realized that the coalition had found a way to formalize their activities within existing legal structures. "This is quite clever," Admiral Chen said, "but Sanctuary Station status requires government approval and regular oversight. Are you prepared to accept those conditions?" Elena had discussed this possibility extensively with the coalition leadership, and they had reached a consensus that formal recognition was worth the compromise of limited oversight. "We're prepared to accept oversight as long as it doesn't interfere with our primary mission of providing sanctuary and assistance to displaced populations." The negotiations that followed were complex and lengthy, involving representatives from multiple TCA departments, as well as coalition leaders from every member species. The final agreement took 3 days to reach, but it established a framework that satisfied both parties' essential requirements. Vasquez Station would receive official recognition as an autonomous sanctuary facility operating under TCA authority. The coalition would maintain full control over internal affairs, sanctuary policies, and the admission of new members, while accepting TCA oversight of external military activities and diplomatic relations. Most importantly, the agreement established a precedent that could be applied to other refugee coalitions throughout TCA territory. Elena felt a deep satisfaction as she watched Admiral Chen sign the formal agreement that legitimized everything the coalition had worked to build. The ceremony took place in the station's main amphitheater, with representatives from all 43 member species present to witness the historic moment. But even as she celebrated this diplomatic victory, Elena knew that greater challenges lay ahead. The agreement with the TCA was just one step in a larger process of integrating refugee coalitions into the galaxy's political structure. Other governments would need to be convinced, other legal frameworks would need to be developed, and the coalition itself would need to continue evolving to meet the needs of an ever-growing population. More immediately, the coalition faced internal challenges that were becoming increasingly complex. Success had brought growth, and growth had brought diversity of opinion about the station's future direction. Some members wanted to focus exclusively on providing sanctuary and assistance, while others argued for more active intervention in galactic conflicts that displaced populations. The question of how to balance humanitarian mission with political influence was becoming a source of ongoing debate. Elena found herself spending more and more time mediating between different factions within the coalition, a responsibility that was far removed from her original work as a mechanical engineer. She discovered that managing a community of diverse species required many of the same skills as fixing complex machinery: careful diagnosis of problems, creative solutions that addressed multiple requirements simultaneously, and the patience to work through complications one step at a time. The establishment of formal legal status also brought new responsibilities and opportunities. The TCA agreement included provisions for the coalition to participate in regional governance councils, giving refugee populations a voice in decisions that affected their welfare. Elena was appointed as the coalition's primary representative to these councils, a role that required her to speak for beings whose experiences and needs were often alien to conventional political thinking. Her first major test in this role came when the regional council was asked to address a humanitarian crisis in the Vega sector, where a civil war had displaced over 3 million beings from a dozen different species. Traditional aid organizations were overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster, and several council members proposed military intervention to establish refugee camps in neutral territory. Elena stood before the council and proposed an alternative: expansion of the sanctuary station network to provide distributed assistance rather than concentrated camps. The coalition had developed techniques for rapidly establishing sanctuary facilities using the combined technologies of multiple species, and they could deploy these capabilities much more quickly than conventional military forces. The proposal was controversial but ultimately successful, leading to the establishment of 17 new sanctuary stations throughout the Vega sector. Each station operated on the same cooperative principles as Vasquez Station, bringing together refugees from multiple species and encouraging them to pool their resources and knowledge for mutual benefit. Elena watched with pride as the network of sanctuary stations grew throughout the region, each facility becoming a beacon of hope for displaced populations who had previously had nowhere to turn for assistance. The model they had developed at Vasquez Station was proving to be remarkably adaptable, working effectively in different political environments and with different combinations of refugee species. But success also brought scrutiny from powers that were less sympathetic to refugee rights than the TCA had ultimately proven to be. Intelligence reports indicated that several aggressive species viewed the growing sanctuary network as a potential threat to their expansion plans, and there were rumors of coordinated efforts to destabilize the coalition through infiltration and sabotage. Elena realized that the coalition had reached a turning point. They were no longer a small group of refugees defending a single station, but a significant political force that influenced regional stability and represented a new model for interspecies cooperation. The choices they made in the coming months would determine whether the sanctuary network continued to grow and provide hope for displaced populations, or whether it would be destroyed by forces that preferred the galaxy to remain divided and weak. Standing in her expanded command center, surrounded by displays showing the locations of 47 sanctuary stations across 6 star systems, Elena felt both pride and apprehension about what the coalition had accomplished. They had proven that cooperation between species could produce remarkable results, but they had also demonstrated that such cooperation posed a challenge to established powers who profited from division and conflict. The real test of the Mechanics Accord was yet to come, as the coalition prepared to defend not just their own sanctuary, but the entire network of hope they had built for the galaxy's forgotten populations. 2 years after the signing of the TCA Sanctuary Agreement, Elena Vasquez stood before the largest gathering of interspecies representatives in recorded galactic history. The Great Assembly Hall of New Geneva Station could accommodate over 50,000 beings, and every seat was filled with delegates from across the known galaxy. What had begun as a desperate defense of a single refugee sanctuary had evolved into something that was reshaping the fundamental nature of galactic civilization. The Mechanics Accord, as historians were already calling the document Elena was about to sign, represented the culmination of everything the sanctuary network had worked to achieve. It was a formal treaty between 80 to 7 different governments, species coalitions, and independent territories that established universal principles for refugee protection and interspecies cooperation and the peaceful resolution of displacement crises. Elena felt the weight of history as she approached the signing podium, but also a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond any personal achievement. The journey from a solitary mechanic station to the center of galactic diplomacy had been neither planned nor sought, but it had proven that individual actions, when guided by compassion and determination, could create changes that resonated across entire civilizations. The events that had led to this moment began 18 months earlier, when intelligence reports confirmed that a coalition of aggressive species was planning coordinated attacks against sanctuary stations throughout the refugee network. The Vashtai had recovered from their humiliating defeat and allied themselves with the Xerian Empire, the Dominion of Kraltak, and several other militaristic powers who viewed the growing sanctuary movement as a threat to their expansion plans. The planned attacks were not random raids, but part of a systematic campaign to destroy the infrastructure that supported displaced populations throughout the galaxy. The aggressive coalition had correctly identified the sanctuary network as a potential obstacle to their territorial ambitions, since stable refugee populations were more difficult to exploit than desperate scattered survivors. With Trust Teddy, Elena had responded to this threat not with military preparation, but with an audacious diplomatic initiative. Rather than simply defending the sanctuary stations, she had proposed expanding the network's mission to include active mediation of the conflicts that created refugee crises in the first place. If the Sanctuary Coalition could prevent wars rather than simply treating their aftermath, they could address the root causes of displacement while demonstrating the value of cooperative problem-solving. The first test of this expanded mission came when border disputes between the hegemony of Talvar and the free worlds of Centauri threatened to erupt into a war that would displace millions of civilians. Traditional diplomatic channels had failed to resolve the conflict, with both sides mobilizing military forces and preparing for what appeared to be inevitable hostilities. Elena had arrived in the disputed region aboard Unity's Promise, the coalition's first purpose-built diplomatic vessel. The ship itself was a testament to the Sanctuary Network's cooperative principles, incorporating technologies from dozens of different species to create a vessel that could safely transport representatives from multiple biological and environmental requirements. The ship's design made it clear to everyone who encountered it that the Sanctuary Coalition represented something genuinely new in galactic politics. The mediation process that followed established the template for what would become known as sanctuary diplomacy. Rather than focusing on the specific territorial disputes that had triggered the conflict, Elena and her team of interspecies mediators addressed the underlying issues that made war seem necessary to both sides. They identified resource shortages, population pressures, and historical grievances that could be resolved through cooperative solutions rather than military conquest. Most importantly, they offered both sides something that traditional diplomacy could not provide: immediate assistance with the humanitarian challenges that would result from continued conflict. The Sanctuary Network could provide emergency aid, temporary housing, and long-term support for civilian populations affected by the border disputes, removing the humanitarian pressure that often forced governments into military action. The Talvar Centauri Accords, signed aboard Unity's Promise after 6 weeks of intensive negotiations, became the model for a new kind of interstellar agreement. Rather than simply establishing borders or trade relationships, the Accords created a framework for ongoing cooperation that addressed the needs of all affected populations, including refugees and displaced persons who had previously been ignored by diplomatic processes. More significantly, the Accords established the first formal recognition of sanctuary stations as legitimate participants in interstellar diplomacy. The refugee populations who would be most affected by territorial conflicts were given a voice in negotiations that determined their fate, a precedent that challenged fundamental assumptions about who had the right to participate in galactic politics. The success of sanctuary diplomacy in resolving the Talvar Centauri crisis attracted attention throughout the galaxy, but it also accelerated the aggressive coalition's plans for military action. Elena learned through intelligence networks that the Vashtai-Xerian Alliance was planning a coordinated assault on 12 sanctuary stations simultaneously, with the goal of destroying the network's infrastructure and scattering its population before they could mount an effective defense. The attack came without warning on what would later be known as Dark Day. 12 heavily armed fleets struck at sanctuary stations across 4 star systems, using overwhelming force in an attempt to end the refugee movement before it could respond. The aggressors had learned from the Vashti defeat at Vasquez Station and came prepared for unconventional defenses and refugee ingenuity. Elena coordinated the defense from the command center of Vasquez Station, now the acknowledged capital of the Sanctuary Network. The battle was unlike anything in the recorded history of galactic warfare, involving not just military vessels but entire civilian populations fighting to defend their homes and communities. The Silicon Shepherds deployed asteroid worms on a scale never before seen, while the Quantum Dancers created subspace disruption fields that made faster-than-light travel impossible throughout the combat zones. The Mirtal Harmonic Networks coordinated defensive actions across multiple star systems simultaneously, and the Adari biotechnologies adapted in real time to counter whatever new weapons the aggressors deployed. Most remarkably, the sanctuary stations did not fight alone. The governments that had signed formal agreements with the refugee network honored their commitments, providing military support and logistical assistance. The TCA deployed 3 full battle groups to defend sanctuary stations in their territory, while dozens of smaller governments contributed whatever forces they could spare. But the most significant support came from civilian populations throughout the galaxy who had been inspired by the Sanctuary Network's example. Independent traders formed supply convoys to keep the stations provisioned during the siege. Planetary governments that had remained officially neutral opened their spaceports to refugee evacuation ships. Even some members of the aggressive coalition's own populations began providing intelligence about planned attacks, unwilling to participate in what they saw as an assault on innocent civilians. The war lasted for 6 months and ended not with military victory but with political collapse within the aggressive coalition. The Xerian Empire withdrew from the alliance when their own population began demanding humanitarian assistance for war refugees. The Dominion of Kraltak found itself facing internal rebellions inspired by Sanctuary Network principles of interspecies cooperation. Even the Vashti military began questioning orders to attack civilian facilities when their own wounded soldiers were treated in Sanctuary Station medical facilities. Elena realized that the Sanctuary Network had won something far more important than a military victory. They had demonstrated that the principles of cooperation, compassion, and mutual aid were more powerful than aggression and conquest when they were applied on a galactic scale. The aftermath of Dark Day brought changes that none of the combatants had anticipated. The aggressive coalition's defeat had created a power vacuum in several regions, but rather than leading to chaos or territorial expansion by other militaristic powers, the vacuum was filled by cooperative initiatives inspired by Sanctuary Network principles. New interspecies councils formed to address regional challenges. Through collaborative problem-solving, trade networks emerged that prioritized mutual benefit over exploitation. Most importantly, refugee populations throughout the galaxy began organizing themselves into effective political constituencies that could not be ignored by established governments. Elena found herself invited to address the Galactic Coordination Assembly, the closest thing to a central government that existed in known space. Her speech to the assembly was simple and direct, focusing on practical solutions rather than political theory. She spoke about fixing things that were broken, about the importance of providing sanctuary for those who had lost their homes, and about the remarkable capabilities that emerged when different species chose cooperation over conflict. The Assembly's response was immediate and overwhelming. A formal resolution recognizing the legitimacy of sanctuary diplomacy passed by a margin of 93%. And invitations poured in from governments throughout the galaxy seeking assistance with their own refugee and humanitarian crises. More importantly, the Assembly voted to establish a permanent sanctuary council with authority to coordinate humanitarian responses to displacement crises throughout known space. Elena was elected as the council's first Director General, a position that formalized her role as the galaxy's primary advocate for refugee rights and interspecies cooperation. The Mechanics Accord that Elena was now preparing to sign represented the culmination of this extraordinary journey. The treaty established universal standards for refugee protection, created mechanisms for preventative diplomacy that could address conflicts before they created displacement crises, and most importantly, recognized displaced populations as legitimate participants in the political processes that affected their lives. As Elena picked up the signing stylus, she thought about all the beings whose lives had been touched by the Sanctuary Network's work. The Adari refugees who had first sought shelter at her station were now leaders in biotechnology research that benefited species throughout the galaxy. The CASA's high engineers had established a university that taught advanced materials science to students from over 100 different worlds. The Silicon Shepherds had become the galaxy's primary experts on sustainable resource management, while the Quantum Dancers provided communication technologies that made interspecies cooperation more effective than ever before. But perhaps most importantly, the children who had grown up in sanctuary stations were now adults who took interspecies cooperation for granted. They spoke multiple languages, understood different cultural perspectives, and approached problems with an instinctive preference for collaborative solutions. They were becoming teachers, scientists, diplomats, and leaders who would carry the Sanctuary Network's principles into the next generation. Elena signed her name to the Mechanics' Accord with steady hands, adding the final signature to a document that represented the hopes and dreams of billions of beings throughout the galaxy. The treaty was not perfect, and she knew that implementing its provisions would require years of patient work and constant vigilance against those who preferred division to unity. But as she looked out at the assembly of representatives from across known space, Elena felt confident that the foundation had been laid for a galaxy where displacement and persecution were no longer accepted as inevitable facts of life. The Mechanics' Accord established the principle that every being had the right to sanctuary when their homes became unsafe, and that the galactic community had a responsibility to provide that sanctuary through cooperative effort. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence for all those who had lost their lives in the struggles that led to this moment, followed by a celebration that continued for 3 days and involved cultural presentations from every species represented in the assembly. Elena watched these celebrations with deep satisfaction, seeing in them the fulfillment of everything she had worked to achieve. The Sanctuary Network had grown from a single repair station into a galactic institution that provided hope and assistance to displaced populations throughout known space. More than that, it had proven that the principles of mechanical repair, careful diagnosis of problems, creative solutions, and patient application of appropriate tools could be applied to the challenges of interspecies relations with remarkable effectiveness. Elena returned to Vasquez Station after the signing ceremony, but she found that her original home had been transformed yet again. The station now served as the administrative center for a network of over 3,000 sanctuary facilities throughout the galaxy, each one a beacon of hope for those who had lost their homes and needed somewhere to heal, rebuild, and plan for the future. Standing in her original workshop, surrounded by the tools and equipment she had used as a simple mechanic, Elena reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. She had never intended to become a galactic leader or a diplomatic innovator. She had simply wanted to fix things that were broken and help people who needed assistance. In the end, that had been enough to change the galaxy. The Mechanics' Accord stood as proof that individual compassion, when supported by community cooperation and principled determination, could overcome even the most entrenched systems of division and exploitation. Elena picked up a hydrospanner and began working on a damaged navigation computer that had been brought in by a newly arrived refugee ship. The work was familiar and comforting, reminding her that even in her role as Director General of the Sanctuary Council, she was still fundamentally a mechanic who fixed things that were broken. And there would always be things that needed fixing. The galaxy was vast and complex, filled with challenges that required patient work and creative solutions. But Elena had learned that those challenges were not insurmountable when people chose to work together rather than against each other. The Mechanics' Accord had established the framework for that cooperation on a galactic scale. Now the real work could begin, building a galaxy where every being could find sanctuary when they needed it. and where the diversity of species and cultures was seen as a source of strength rather than a cause for conflict. Elena smiled as she completed the navigation computer repair, knowing that somewhere in the galaxy, another small act of compassion was beginning another journey toward hope. The Sanctuary Network had taught her that the most important changes often began with simple gestures of help offered to those who needed it most. The galaxy was vast, but it was also filled with beings who, when given the opportunity, chose cooperation over conquest and compassion over cruelty. The Mechanics Accord ensured that they would have that opportunity for generations to come. The Mechanics Accord, establishing a safe harbor for lost ships and wayward alien souls. HFY Sci-Fi.